Hi everyone. In today's episode, we head to the rainforests of Gunung Mulu National Park in the Malaysian territory of the island of Borneo. Rainforests are some of the world's most biodiverse environments, and the Bornean rainforests, some of the world's oldest, are no exception. These are the focus of two paintings from 2015 in Tony Foster's Exploring Beauty Watercolor Diaries from the Wild Journey. The first is called From Near Paku Falls Looking South, 5 Days, a painting featuring two enormous buttressed rainforest trees. These buttresses are a special adaptation to help anchor rainforest trees in thin, poor rainforest soils. The second painting is smaller, called Near Paku Falls Looking 20 Degrees North-Northeast. The distinguished luminary who nominated the rainforests of Borneo for Tony's journey is Professor Sir Gillian Prance, a former director of Kew Royal Botanic Gardens in London, as well as other botanical institutions. As an expert on plants, he specifically called out the buttressed rainforest trees of Borneo as some of the world's most beautiful and most spectacular. These trees grow very tall. In fact, they're some of the tallest rainforest trees in the world. To create these paintings, Tony Foster planted himself in the rainforest for hours at a time, which was no easy feat. He had to deal with mud, mold, incessant humidity, sweltering heat, and biting insects, not to mention regular intervals of pouring rain. But the experience was eye-opening in many ways. He got to pay close attention to the rich, biodiverse world around him, and, by slowing down through his painting practice, noticed its treasures. Tony also got to know some of the members of the hunter-gatherer Penan tribe, who showed him all kinds of wonderful rainforest gems. They are masters of noticing things. In Tony's words, they would see me painting in the rainforest and would say, Tony, come see this!" And they would take me and show me some enormous insect or some bird's nest that I hadn't seen, or some frightful thing where this giant slug was devouring a giant worm. They would take me to show me all sorts of extraordinary things which I never even noticed. I walked past, but I didn't see it. But they are so attuned to their environment, they see all this stuff. Myself, I love getting outside into nature to explore, and I've found and amassed some dead insect specimens over the years. These are treasures for my natural history collection. In the spirit of the many insects living in the rainforest, I'd like to today demonstrate how I would paint this iridescent beetle from Southeast Asia, which was given to me as a gift. Of course, every kind of insect will be a different challenge to paint with watercolors, but my hope is that by even just working on one type of subject like this, you'll pick up some tricks to help you tackle others. I encourage you to get outside too and pay close attention to the small details in local nature. Keep an eye out for dead insects to use for your painting subjects too. You can learn so much by studying and painting these critters. As always, if you'd like to follow along with this painting demonstration and you haven't yet watched it, go back and check out my materials video to learn what supplies you'll need. I'll be sticking today with a basic kit: watercolor paper, a pencil and eraser, water, watercolor paints and brushes, and some paper towel. Because this beetle is small and it's an intricate subject, my plan is to render it much larger than life and to allow myself the time to fuss over those details. Grab your brushes and come join me. So here's my beetle again. You can see that it's encased in resin, which is pretty useful because I can turn it all kinds of directions and store it safely without fear of damaging it. Now, this specimen is going to be particularly challenging to render because of the metallic sheen, the iridescence that it has. You can see that in particular when I change its angle. You can see there's also the reflection of the resin, but you can see how the exoskeleton is changing colors as well as I move it. One thing that's constant, however, is you always have these very dark margins, and then the inner part is always going to be more of a green, a very bright, vibrant green. So, as you can see, I've gone ahead and created the drawing for this beetle just to cut out that time, since it did take me a while to render it. I did some sketches beforehand to map out the different parts, understand a little bit about this beetle's anatomy, and then I went ahead and created my final drawing, keeping it in this case from a symmetrical angle. But you can choose to render it any which way you want, including sideways like this. You could do the underside of your insect. Lots of beetles will have iridescence, or they might be sort of a matte texture, or they could be very shiny and have very bright highlights. In our case, we're going to deal today with iridescence. So take some time first and get to know your specimen, understand a bit of what the different parts are, and then create your drawing. I created mine particularly dark. Normally I like to render pretty light just so that the pencil doesn't stick out too much through the transparency of the watercolor. But in this case, since our specimen is such a dark subject, and especially in the parts where my pencil guidelines are, it won't really matter. Those will fade in. And if anything, those dark lines will just be easier to see and to help me map out the form as I apply different layers of watercolor. One thing you'll notice is that the beetle specimen that I have encased in resin doesn't have antennae. And I think those must have just been plucked off at some point. Maybe they're not very easy to encase in resin. In any case, when I was drawing the beetle, I noticed that there weren't any antennae. And so I went ahead and drew those in, roughly how they should look. So to begin, I'm actually going to block out a couple of highlight areas with liquid mask. I didn't mention liquid mask at the beginning when I was giving the introduction to this video. And the truth is you don't really need it. You could just omit certain areas. But because I have it, I think I'm going to use it. So this is the liquid mask, or art masking fluid, or Frisket, that I'm going to be using today. And I've got a handy little dowel that I'm going to use to apply it. So let's get some on here. So again, this is going to resist any watercolor that I'm applying on these areas. And right now it's going to retain the white of the paper. At the end I can remove this and have a bright white, not affected by any of the watercolor that I'm going to be applying in different glazes, different layers. And I'm just putting these on roughly corresponding to what I'm seeing in this specimen. If your specimen is tiny, it really helps to have a loupe or a microscope or something that allows you to get in close and see some more of the detail. So I think that's the majority of the highlights that I'm seeing, at least the prominent ones. Some of the other highlights that you're seeing in this photograph of my specimen are actually just reflections of bubbles in the resin. So it's areas of the beetle that didn't get completely covered by resin and trapped these little air bubbles. And so they're creating false highlights. So I think I'm going to omit those. While this is drying, let's mix up our base colors. So we have greens and some very dark, almost black color that are very prominent in this beetle. For the green, I'm going to be using Winsor Green mixed with Winsor Yellow, a lighter yellow. And then for the black, again, we don't want to use straight black from a tube because something about it, it's such an artificial color that it doesn't blend well, it doesn't harmonize well with the other colors. Very noticeably distinct and unnatural. So we want to create a more tonal black, a black that blends in and harmonizes more with the colors that we are using. So for our black today, we're going to use a base of Ivory Black mixed with French Ultramarine, and then we're going to add in some of the Winsor Green as well, just because that'll create more cohesion between the green of the beetle and then this dark color that we're creating, if they're all sharing some element of green. And because these colors are going to be covering up most of my subject, I'll want to create plenty of each so as not to have to remix. And to this black, I'm going to add a tad of the Winsor Green. The Ivory Black is really overpowering, so your ratios of blue and green that you're going to add to that black need to be fairly high in order to actually make a difference. Okay, so I've tested out the colors and gotten something that seems pretty close. It's this one here for the dark, and then this one here for my green. And I'm going to start with that. Now that my liquid mask is dry, we can get started. You can see that in my drawing I've mapped out with these little dots the rough areas corresponding to greens and then blacks. Greens on the inside, blacks on the outside, just to give myself a bit of a map. And so now I'm going to work quickly and lay down my base colors on the body of this insect. And I say work quickly because I want to be able to do a little bit of blending, and so I don't want my first layer to dry completely before I'm putting the second one on. If that does happen, then there are tricks that I can use to blend later, but ideally I want to work wet and wet a little bit in the beginning. So there's my green. Now I'm going to wipe off my brush with some water and then take my damp brush and just extend some of these edges here. Again, I'm working very lightly and loose. I'm just concentrating on broad shapes. Okay, and then while this is still wet, it's still a little too wet to do a lot of blending, but I can start using my black on some of the other parts that aren't touching so much. For example, up here where I don't have that much water. This is such a beautiful thing about watercolors, this looseness and this richness that comes with letting colors flow into one another like this. This flat brush really helps me get right up to these edges that I've created with my pencil marks. You can see this is very wet still. You'll see as we get further along, what's going to create the illusion of iridescence is having a very stark contrast between the green and the black. So we don't want a nice gradual transition between green to black. We want stark black to then green. That'll give us the illusion of the highlight and of iridescence. Okay, and while this part is still drying, because it's still very wet, I'm going to take a finer brush and work in some of the details of the legs. So here I'm just going to basically go carefully and just fill in each of these leg segments with this black that I've created. So I'm going to go ahead and speed up here. I should mention that while Tony Foster didn't paint any insects on his trip to Borneo, he has painted many insects in past journeys, notably on his trip to Costa Rica that he did in 1991, 1992, where he did studies of tropical moths and butterflies and roaches and bees, crickets and beetles. And you can see how accurately and how beautifully he's captured them. Even creatures that some people might not consider to be intrinsically beautiful, like the roaches, take on a whole new light. So I've got a good foundation now established, and while this is still drying, I'm going to add a bit more of the French Ultramarine to this black. Well, I'll make a separate pool right over here because I want that blue to be some of the transition between the green and this blackish that I have. So I'm just going to add that in a couple places where I feel like it could become a nice border between the black and the green. It's okay if it becomes more of your black too, because ultimately we're going to darken this. But the blue is just so vibrant that I think it will help. Okay, so now I'm going to just re-emphasize some of these. As I was saying, the green and the black need to not have a gradual fade between them. They need to be more distinct because that'll help convey iridescence. So I'll take some of my blue black and some water and just start refining these edges a bit, paying attention to what's happening in this beetle specimen. From the photo, it's easier because it's one snapshot of the beetle's iridescence. It's not moving around as I move my eyes around the subject. So in some ways that's easier. Make it a nice, rich black. And I noticed that there's these sort of vertical lines happening in some of the exoskeleton. And these two plates back here, these are called the elytra. So I'm gonna, as I'm working now, just add a little bit of that. It may go away later if I do another layer, another glaze, but at least it helps me remember that those are there, and then I can re-accentuate them if I need to. And I also see a couple of horizontal looking ones. I think they're sort of wrinkles in these elytra, so just a little bit put on like that. You can have a lot of fun with this part. It's sort of the wet and wet, and so you just kind of go wild with it. Push and pull the water only being careful not to overwork and then potentially ruin your paper if it gets too sodden. And for me, this part of the watercolor painting is a bit of improvisation. I mean, you can map out beforehand a specific way to do something, but I tend to like to explore and experiment a bit. And sometimes you may fail, and that's okay. You can always try again with a different attempt, or you can just work with whatever has failed and make it look okay. So I'm just kind of pushing and pulling the color right now while observing the form, observing the insect and seeing what's there. I think that's good for now for the blacks, but I am gonna carefully grab some of my green again and just accentuate a couple of spots, being careful not to touch the black areas since those ones are still very wet and it would create a backwash if I was doing that, if I were to touch that. Okay, and once this dries, we'll do another layer with the green and we'll actually go over some of the black areas. And because the green has the Winsor Yellow in it, the Winsor Yellow tends to be, it's a transparent color, but it can have a little opaque quality to it. So it will actually blot some of the darks that we have, and we may need to re-accentuate those later. But what's nice about glazing like that is that you get a bit more connection between the two areas, the dark and the light. Let's let that dry. All right, so now we're dry again. I brought out the specimen just to look again for comparison for myself. And you can see how the iridescence here is different than what we're seeing in the photo. The iridescence here shows more red or orange towards the middle here. And so I can put some of that in if I want. My watercolor underlayer, what I've got for my foundation essentially, is still rough. It's not quite where I want it to be, but it's a good foundation and I'm going to build up from there. So I think the next thing I'm going to do is intensify my greens a bit. I'll take the green that I had previously mixed up and just lay some more of this on, in certain areas especially. And I can even start to cover some of the black. I left a couple of spots there that are lighter horizontal lines because of those wrinkles that we were seeing. And then let's see what happens on this side. Yeah, this is better. So this layer isn't it's wet, but it's not like soaking like my first layer was, because I don't want to lift up too much of the paint that's already down. Good, so that's looking a lot more intense now, color intensity wise. You can see why it's helpful to have that Frisket down for these highlights. If you didn't use Frisket, or if you're planning on not using Frisket, you can do this as well. You just have to avoid those little white areas, which can be tough. Accidentally lifted some of the black in there. I was pressing a bit too hard with my brush. It's always a concern when you're doing glazing like this. You got to be very gentle. What I'm missing in all of this, I've got blues and blacks and greens and yellows. I'm missing red. And without having even just like a tad of red in there, or some sort of orangey color, some variation of red, I'm not making use of the full color spectrum. So I am going to add a little bit of orange to this piece. And for that, I'm going to use Winsor Red. But this is a very intense color, so I want to use just a little bit and make sure to mute that with some Cadmium Yellow, make it more of an orangey. And I like to add red into yellow, preferably because the red is more intense than the yellow. And so I can do it conservatively, put in a little at a time. So I'll take a little bit of water for that, make it less intense. I want it to be fairly subtle. And I'll do some more with the green. So that green dried faster than I wanted it to, and my orange ended up sitting on top. So now that I've added some more green back, I'm able to get that orange to disperse a bit more, which is what I wanted originally. A little more wet than I'd like it to be, but it should work. So while I wait for that to dry, take my tiny brush, which I haven't used yet, and clean up some more details on the legs. Just emphasize darker areas. The whole thing is very dark, but I can even, within this darkness, do a little bit of extra value. So you can see that it's subtle, but there is a difference. Or maybe you can't see it from the camera. The disadvantage to this brush is that it doesn't hold that much pigment in water, so I have to keep going back to my well to dip it. But of course, the pro is that it's so fine that I can do tons of little detail pretty easily. And for now, I'm still leaving these little green highlights on these legs intact. Later, towards the end, when I'm doing detail work, I will fuzz those out and get them to look more like highlights, glowing green. It's got this horn here. I'm going to leave a tiny gap between this area here and the horn. Almost imperceptible, but enough to help me define the two areas, keep them separate. Got this other horn, semi-hammerhead-like. And then part of the head here with these horns right above the eyes. And then these antennae. I think these have a little bit of brown in them, so I'll take some of this red, just close enough, and some black. Just give it a tad of color. That it's almost imperceptible, but it does something. And then I notice the eyes have a little bit of this brown kind of fuzz on them towards the edge as well. Little bits of color like this, subtleties, add a lot to the piece. I'm going to put some as well on this horn up here. And then something that I've missed altogether are these two little plates, pieces of wing or something that extend out of the sides. And these are more brown, so they're kind of translucent, but I don't want to spend too much time on them. Last brown bit back here. I think now we can start doing some of the details. I'm going to go for a bigger brush, one that can make nice fine lines, and take my black, start doing some of the details, but this time I think I'll add a bit of the red to open up my color spectrum in this piece a bit more. It's still going to be very black. It's still going to be a very dark color, but the idea is that it's incorporating some of that red to give us some more color variety. And I don't want my brush too wet. I gotta start going over all these deep edges. And again, you only want to do this when your foundation is super dry, otherwise you'll get backwash and it'll become pretty messy very quick. I still have a couple wet areas, so I'm going to avoid those for now. For this you need a bit of a steady hand. Some of the iridescence looks like it's starting to show now, especially now that I've defined some of the beetle's features, like these details, these edges and such. It's giving these blobs of color more context. It's just like cleaning up. We're cleaning up house, cleaning up beetle. But as with everything watercolor, in general, you're working light to dark, and you're working wet to dry, and you're working less specific to more detailed over time. So that's looking better. Take this dark that I've produced, this reddish black, dilute it slightly. It's still pretty intense. Let's see. Something like that. And just darken some of these brown areas that I've created, because really they're not that noticeable, and in mine they're still fairly prominent. So we're just going to mute them a bit, fade them into the background. And I'm going to touch up some of these areas that I had accidentally lifted before. Now I'm going to switch to my shorter brush, the one I was using originally. Just make sure that's clean. I'll take the edge of it and just fuzz out a little bit of these sharp highlights that we have in the legs so that they are less intense. Sort of blend them in with their background. And I will get some of my reddish black and add that in as well. We want these to be very subtle iridescent highlights. This one's working pretty well here, although this one's it's a bit brighter than these ones should be over on this side, so we'll mute these down just a bit more. And then with this same brush, now that it's damp, I can pull some more highlights. So for example, here I hadn't left a highlight. I use a damp brush like this to start lifting, and then I'll clean off some of what I've lifted and lift a bit more. And I'm sort of carving through the layer of black that I had painted, but gently. And I can deposit some color in there too. I'll take a bit of this green. And you know what? I'm going to switch to a smaller brush because even that one's too big for these legs. So take my small brush, very damp, and just start pulling away at the color, and then I'll replace some of that with my green. You can see that these are looking a little bit more reflective. Do a tiny bit up here. Working in reverse now a bit, but since this is so dark, I can afford to pull out some lights and do it in a way that is very detailed to give some definition, extra definition. It's subtleties, but the details will do a lot. And I can even use this technique to pull a little bit of the color right on the edge of some of these plates, as if this edge right here is being hit by light coming from this direction. It gives it a tiny bit of 3D-ness. It makes it look more real. I'll do the same right here. And I'm wiping my brush off in between these pulls to clean it off a little bit. Just certain edges that could use a bit more light. Okay, and I just noticed that here there's a bit of layers going on, like 3 layers, dark, medium, and then green. And I'll see if I can blend that just a tiny bit with this touch-up brush. But I could just leave it. It's really not that noticeable, and it kind of plays into the iridescence effect. But let's see if I can just touch that up. This is the problem, is you get too involved in the watercolor, too much detail, and then at some point it fails, it backfires. I think that's good. I'm going to leave it. So now what I can do is remove the frisket, and then we can clean that up. This part here is already dry. Use this eraser. Pull that, and you can see just how starkly white they are. These areas of frisket. Very bright, too bright in fact, and the shapes are not working well to create the effect of highlights. So we're going to work to mute these down and just clean them up. So for example, where this black line is, I need to repaint. So I'll take my black color, of which I've made so much, and make that continuous through these white areas. And I'm going to use the small brush for all of this because it's such fine detail work. I'm working at a scale where I need to work small. And then I'll take my green, start patching those in as well. I want there to be a gap between the highlight and the edge. And I want the highlights to be more parallel to the edges which they follow. Less blobular, more sleek. Okay, it's getting better. You can see it looks a little bit more like a highlight. Now what we need to do though is fuzz out some of these edges so I can refer back to my beetle specimen just to kind of see what I'm doing again. Basically, these highlights shouldn't be, not all of them at least, should be as bright as they are. So I've created a diluted green, and I'll paint that over some or all, depending on which highlight it is. This one, I think, will do most of it. The problem with Frisket is that it has such sharp edges that you really have to work to get those out, unless you want that, unless that's part of your piece. But in this case, they're distracting and they don't work to create the highlight effect that I'm looking for. So I can even dab some of these off, basically repairing at this point. You know what? It seems like I didn't even need that Frisket after all. I could have just lifted most of these out and been just fine. So I stand with what I originally said. You don't need Frisket for this one. Okay, and I'm going to call it done at this point. It's a little overworked, especially where I had to do some repair. But overall, the effect of iridescence seems present. And it seems pretty 3D and lifelike to me, which is what I was going for. So that part's good. And there you have it, a beetle. Now that you've completed this painting, challenge yourself to try another insect, something completely different. A butterfly, a fly, a grasshopper perhaps. There are so many to choose from, and these are found virtually everywhere, and they come in all kinds of sizes, colors, and textures. Keep an eye out as you wander around outside. You're bound to find some dead insects for your nature collection. And I guarantee you'll develop a keen eye for finding these sometimes cryptic creatures in the wild. I will happily answer any questions you have about how to tackle a particular type of insect in the YouTube comments below this video. If you enjoyed this episode, please give this video a like and subscribe to this channel. You can check out the other videos in this series on this channel or on the Foster website at www.thefoster.org. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.